Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to have you with me for another quiet hour of reason and reflection. Tell me, is there paper near you tonight? Perhaps a book left open, a pen resting at an angle, the small evidence of a mind that has been at work. Watson noticed such things. He understood that an evening well observed is never wasted. Do subscribe to Watson's Margins, so these gentle investigations are always close at hand. The link to our Spotify channel is waiting for you in the description below. Now settle in, for as a certain resident of Baker Street once reminded us, it is a capital mistake to overlook what is quietly, patiently, there. Chapter 1. The Snowbound Chancery Retreat. It is a peculiarity of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes that the most singular of our investigations have invariably commenced under the most unremarkable of pretexts. A letter arrives, a card is left, a telegram is pressed into one's hand at breakfast. So, it was in that bitter January of 1895 that I found myself seated opposite Holmes in a hired carriage, jolting northward through a countryside steadily surrendering itself to winter, the hedgerows buried, and the sky the colour of old pewter. The invitation had come some 4 days prior, bearing the crest of one Mr. Cornelius Farrow, a barrister of considerable standing, and, as Holmes was pleased to inform me, a man whose particular specialty lay in the confidential arbitration of matters too delicate for the public courts. The letter was brief, as Farrow's communications invariably were, requesting Holmes's attendance at Blackridge Hall in Derbyshire, where a gathering of legal and government men had assembled for what Farrow described only as a review of sensitive depositions. Holmes had read the letter twice, set it upon the mantelpiece, and within the hour had informed Mrs. Hudson that we should require our heavier coats. I confess that as we drew nearer to our destination, I was more sensible of the cold than of any professional anticipation. The coachman had warned us some miles back that the sky had the look of snow about it, and his prediction proved correct with considerable emphasis. By the time the carriage wheels crunched up the gravel approach to Blackridge Hall, the flakes were falling in earnest, thick and purposeful, and settling upon the dark stone of the hall's facade with the quiet determination of something that intended to stay. Blackridge Hall was an Elizabethan pile of considerable antiquity and indifferent comfort, its mullioned windows staring out across a park that had become, in the space of our arrival, entirely white. A steward, who introduced himself as Mr. Arden Croft, a compact and efficient man of middle years with something of the military about his bearing, received us at the door with the composed courtesy of one who has managed difficult guests before and found the task beneath him. Farrow himself greeted us in the entrance hall, a tall, dry-complexioned man in his 60s, whose handshake communicated both warmth and urgency. He drew Holmes aside almost immediately, and I occupied myself by removing my greatcoat and examining the hall's furnishings, which were substantial without being ostentatious, the sort of room that announces old money rather than new. The other guests were assembled in the long sitting-room, gathered about a fire of commendable proportions. Farrow introduced us in turn. There was Mr. Justice Alderton, a broad-shouldered man whose grey whiskers and deliberate movements gave him the appearance of permanent judicial contemplation. Beside him stood two solicitors, Messrs. Penhaligon and Carew, the former a thin, nervous individual given to adjusting his spectacles, the latter a florid and self-satisfied man who greeted Holmes with the slightly excessive cordiality of someone who wished it to be known that he was not impressed. There was also a Mr. Tobias Renwick, as introduced as a government agent, a phrase that was left agreeably vague, a smooth-faced man of perhaps 40, with a sort of watchful stillness that I associated less with the law than with its more discreet applications. Finally there was the judge's clerk, a Mr. Silas Prine, young, pale, and possessed of ink-stained fingers and an expression of anxious industry. Holmes stood amongst them with his hands clasped behind his back, and said almost nothing, which those who did not know him might have mistaken for diffidence. I knew it for what it was. He was listening, observing, cataloguing, Dinner that evening was a restrained affair. The conversation kept carefully to matters of no consequence. The snow continued to fall beyond the tall windows, and by the time we retired the world outside the hall had been entirely remade. I looked out before extinguishing my candle and saw nothing but white extending to the tree line, and above it a sky so dense with falling snow that the darkness itself seemed muffled. Holmes tapped upon my door at something past 11. I found him in his travelling clothes, a state of alertness about him that I knew from long experience meant he had not slept and did not intend to. "The road from the village will be impassable by morning," he said, without preamble. "The coachman said as much," I agreed. "The telegraph wire follows the eastern lane. Observe." He gestured toward the window, where I could see, against the pale light reflected from the snow, that several of the poles along the distant hedgerow had bent at irregular angles under the accumulation. "We are entirely isolated, Watson. No communication in or out until the storm breaks." I asked him whether this concerned him. "It interests me," he said, and there was in his voice that particular quality of restrained satisfaction which invariably preceded something of consequence. "I observed this afternoon that Mr. Croft, our steward, has mud upon his left boot that is inconsistent with the gravel paths of this estate. The soil is distinctly clay-heavy, of the kind found in the lower field beyond the kitchen garden, a field which, so far as I can determine, there was no occasion for a man in his position to visit today. Furthermore, the candlestick upon the study mantelpiece has been moved and replaced at a slightly incorrect angle, leaving a faint but unmistakable circular impression in the dust. And the long case clock in the corridor chimes on the half-hour some 8 seconds after it ought to, suggesting a recent and imperfect adjustment. These observations, offered in so quiet and methodical a fashion, might have seemed inconsequential to another. To me they were not. In 17 years of association with Holmes, I had learned that when he troubled to mention a detail, it was because the detail had already begun to form part of an architecture invisible to every other eye in the room. "And what do you conclude?" I asked. "Nothing yet," he said. "I conclude nothing. I observe. There is a considerable difference, Watson, which the majority of mankind has never fully appreciated." He moved toward the door. "Sleep if you can. I suspect the morning will require our full attention." It did, but not in any fashion that either of us, at that late and snow-hushed hour, could yet have imagined. Chapter 2. A File of Singular Importance. Morning brought the particular hush that only a deep snowfall can impose upon the world. I rose early, drew back the curtain, and looked out upon a landscape entirely transformed. The park was a vast undifferentiated white, broken only by the dark verticals of the beeches, and, at the far edge of vision, the bent posture of the telegraph poles Holmes had indicated the previous night. The sky had lightened to a pale and milky grey, still thick with cloud, still threatening. There would be no thaw today. I dressed and descended to find that Holmes had been at breakfast some time before me. His cup was cold and only partly drunk, his toast untouched. And he was standing at the window with his pipe, watching the snow with the focused inattention of a man whose thoughts are entirely elsewhere. The other guests assembled gradually. Mr. Justice Alderton arrived first, as I might have expected of a man accustomed to the governance of his own hours, and accepted tea from the sideboard with a nod that conveyed both authority and self-sufficiency. The solicitors came down together, Penhaligon clutching a small leather portfolio, and Carew conversing with the effortless facility of a man who finds silence disagreeable. Prine, the clerk, slipped into the room quietly and took his place at the far end of the table, with the demeanour of a man long practised in occupying as little space as possible. Rennick appeared last, as immaculate and composed as he had been the evening before, and poured himself coffee with the unhurried precision of someone who performs every small action, as though it may be subject to later scrutiny. Farrow called the party to attention once the breakfast things had been cleared. He stood at the head of the table with the easy command of a man who had conducted difficult proceedings in far less comfortable rooms, and set before us, in measured and deliberate language, the matter that had brought us all to Blackridge Hall. The deposition in question had been gathered over a period of some months by a parliamentary committee charged with examining certain financial irregularities in the administration of several Crown properties. The testimony it contained was, Farrow explained, politically sensitive in the highest degree, involving parties whose names he was not at liberty to divulge in open company, and it was for precisely this reason that the document had never entered the normal channels of legal custody. Instead, it had been decided by persons of sufficient authority that their identity alone guaranteed the arrangement, that a small and trusted body of legal minds should convene privately to review its contents, verify its integrity, and recommend a course of action before the matter was placed before the committee's full membership. The document itself had arrived at Blackridge Hall 3 days prior to our gathering. It was contained within a stiff-backed leather folder, sealed with dark red wax bearing the impression of a signet ring I did not recognise, and it was held in the locked study on the ground floor. The key to that study, Farrow made clear, was held exclusively by Mr. Justice Alderton as the presiding authority of the group. No copies of the document existed. It was, in the fullest sense of the word, unique. There was a silence when Farrow concluded. Penhaligon adjusted his spectacles. Carew cleared his throat and made some remark about the gravity of the responsibility that was perhaps intended to sound reassuring but did not quite succeed. Rennick said nothing at all and continued to regard his coffee cup with an expression of perfect equanimity. I watched Holmes. He had turned from the window during Farrow's address and now stood slightly apart from the group, and I knew from the particular set of his jaw that several things were presenting themselves to his mind simultaneously. He asked only 2 questions. The first was directed to Alderton. Had the judge examined the document personally since its arrival? Alderton replied that he had verified the seal's integrity upon receipt and had not opened it, the full review being intended for that afternoon session. The second question Holmes put to the room at large: was everyone present fully acquainted with the study's location and the arrangement regarding the key? They were, it emerged, having been briefed by Farrow in a preliminary communication some days before. Holmes nodded at this and said nothing further. Farrow, I thought, looked at him with something between hope and unease, the expression of a man who has engaged a specialist and is now uncertain whether the specialist's thoroughness will prove an asset or a complication. The morning passed in desultory fashion. The snow rendered the grounds inaccessible, and the isolation of the hall imposed upon its occupants a peculiar enforced intimacy. I spent an hour in the library, which was well stocked with volumes of a legal rather than literary character, and another in conversation with Farrow, who, once the formalities of his professional address were set aside, proved an engaging and erudite man of wide reading. Holmes, meanwhile, moved through the public rooms of the hall with the unhurried and apparently aimless circulation that I had long since learned to read as the most purposeful form of activity he possessed. I encountered him briefly in the corridor outside the study, where he appeared to be examining the lock with a degree of attention one might more reasonably devote to a museum exhibit. An excellent mechanism, he said, without looking up. Chubb, of recent manufacture. 3 levers, well maintained. The scratch I mentioned last evening is here. He indicated with the stem of his pipe a mark so faint that I could not have identified it as artificial without his guidance. Not a pick mark, something broader, made, I should estimate, within the last 48 hours. I asked him what might have made such a mark. Patience, Watson, he said, with the brief and not unkind smile that served him in place of apology. A catalogue of facts without a sufficient number of entries is merely a list of uncertainties. Let us acquire a few more before we begin to arrange them. The afternoon session was convened at 2:30. Alderton produced the key, a substantial brass instrument of simple design, unlocked the study, and admitted the group. The room was a small book-lined affair smelling pleasantly of cedar and old paper, with a single window giving onto the snow-covered kitchen garden latched firmly shut. The document was exactly where it had been placed, at the centre of the leather-topped desk, its seal unbroken, and to all appearances entire. There was the moment before Alderton broke the seal when the room was very still, and the only sound was the muffled silence of the snow against the window. I noticed, in that moment, 3 things, because Holmes had taught me over many years to use moments of stillness as occasions for observation. Rennick's gaze moved briefly but distinctly to the fireplace rather than the document. Prine placed both hands flat upon his thighs in the manner of a man steadying himself, and Croft, the steward, who had accompanied the group as far as the study door under the pretext of ensuring the fire had been adequately laid, lingered perhaps 2 seconds longer in the doorway than his purpose required before withdrawing. I said nothing of this to Holmes until we had returned to the sitting-room. He heard me out with his eyes half closed and his fingertips pressed together, and when I had finished he was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "You're improving, Watson," he said. "Those are precisely the 3 details I should have drawn your attention to myself." It was perhaps the finest compliment he had ever paid me, and I confess I retired that evening in considerably better spirits than the circumstances, on reflection, entirely warranted. Chapter 3. The Impossible Breach. I've set down, in the course of these records, a great many mornings of consequence. There was the morning of the speckled band, when I loaded my revolver by candlelight and followed Holmes into a darkness that resolved itself into something worse than I had imagined. There was the grey dawn of the Brixton Road case, which began my acquaintance with Holmes entirely and set the course of the better part of my adult life. But I do not think any morning of my experience produced quite the quality of collective bewilderment that descended upon the assembled party of Blackridge Hall when Silas Prine, arriving at the study door at 8:15 with a sheaf of preparatory notes for the day's review, discovered that the deposition file had been tampered with. He came to find Holmes first, which was, in retrospect, the most interesting detail of the immediate aftermath. Not Farrow, not Alderton, but Holmes. I was present when Prine appeared in the doorway of the breakfast room, his face the colour of the snow outside and his portfolio pressed to his chest like a shield. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I think you had better come." Holmes was on his feet before the sentence was complete. The study presented, at first inspection, every appearance of inviolability. The window latch was engaged precisely as it had been the previous afternoon. The chimney, above a fire now reduced to cold ash, was of the sort common to older Elizabethan properties, a narrow and tortuous flue no grown person could have negotiated in either direction. The door had been locked. Prine had required Alderton to produce the key before entry was possible, and Alderton, roused from his room in considerable agitation, had produced it from the inner pocket of the coat hanging on his bedpost, where it had remained. He insisted with the indignation of a man whose word has never previously been questioned, throughout the night. And yet the document had been altered. It was Alderton himself who identified the substitution, the moment he opened the folder and ran his eye down the first page. He said nothing for several seconds, in the manner of a man whose professional composure is engaged in active combat with his astonishment. Then he set the document flat upon the desk and said, with extraordinary quietness, that the testimony on the opening 3 pages was not what he had read during the previous afternoon's review. The wording had been changed. Certain names, certain figures, certain dates. The alteration was subtle, and Alderton conceded, yet would have passed undetected by anyone unfamiliar with the original language. The wax seal, however, appeared entirely intact. I examined it myself at Holmes's invitation. The impression was clear and complete, the wax uncracked, the margins of the seal undisturbed. There was no evidence of the document having been unfolded and resealed. No new wax had been applied over old. It was, by every observable standard, the same seal that had been in place when Alderton broke it the previous afternoon, and the same seal, or its precise likeness, as that which had been present upon the document's arrival. The group assembled in the study within 20 minutes of Prine's discovery. The atmosphere was one I find difficult to describe with precision. There was anger, certainly, from Carew, whose florid face had achieved a deeper and less agreeable shade than usual. There was something close to fear in Penhaligon, who had removed his spectacles entirely and was turning them over in his hands with repetitive agitation. Rennick remained precisely as he always was, which was, I was beginning to think, itself a kind of performance. Farrow stood beside the desk with his arms folded and said very little, in the manner of a man who is rapidly reassessing a situation he had believed he had under control. Holmes moved through all of it as though it were not happening. He examined the window frame with his lens. He knelt at the hearth and spent some time with the cold ash, his face 6 inches from the grate. He looked at the underside of the desk and then at the floor around it, and tracing some invisible path of interest from the desk to the door and back again. When he finally straightened and addressed the room, it was to make an observation that visibly irritated at least 3 of its occupants. The impossibility, he said, is too well constructed. Carew demanded clarification, in the tone of a man accustomed to demanding it. A genuine crime, committed under genuine constraints, produces genuine imperfection, Holmes said. Locks are scratched rather more than this. Ash is distributed rather less tidily. Windows, when examined by gaslight rather than by the cold light of discovery, show traces of handling that even the most careful hand leaves behind. What we have here is an impossibility that has been arranged, not merely committed. The locked room is not an obstacle the criminal was obliged to overcome. It is scenery. This remark was received in silence. It was not a comfortable silence. Alderton, who had remained at the desk throughout, spoke with the measured authority of a man who has presided over complicated proceedings long enough to know when a question is more valuable than a statement. He asked Holmes what, in specific terms, he believed had occurred. "I believe nothing in specific terms," Holmes replied. "Belief without evidence is the province of the credulous, and I have made it a lifelong practice to disappoint them. What I can tell you is what did not occur. No person entered this room from outside during the night. The window latch shows no disturbance of its interior dust pattern, which would have been inevitable had it been operated from without by any mechanical means. The chimney, as you can verify, is structurally impassable. The door lock was not picked. The scratch I observed yesterday is old, not fresh. Whoever altered this document did so without entering this room last night." "That is a logical impossibility," said Renwick. It was the first remark he'd volunteered all morning, offered in a tone of polite correction. "Very nearly," Holmes agreed, "which suggests that the question we should be asking is not how the document was altered during the night, but whether our assumptions about when the alteration occurred are themselves correct." He said nothing further on the matter. He asked instead that no one leave the hall, citing the snow as a practical rather than investigative reason, a courtesy to those assembled which several of them visibly appreciated. Then he withdrew from the study, motioning to me with a slight inclination of his head. In the corridor, out of earshot of the others, he paused and turned to face me with the expression he wore when he wished to think aloud, without wishing to be heard thinking. "The ash in that fireplace," he said quietly, "is not household coal. The household coal at Blackridge Hall burns to a fine grey residue, as I verified in the sitting-room grate this morning. The ash in the study grate is darker and coarser. Different fuel was burned there, and recently. Someone wished to dispose of something, Watson, and did not trouble, or did not have occasion, to ensure the means of disposal was consistent with the house." He glanced back at the closed study door. "The sealed room is a fiction," he said, "a very accomplished one. But the ash is real, and real things, however small, have a persistent habit of being honest." Chapter 4. Flaws Beneath Certainty. There is a quality to Holmes's silences that I have never satisfactorily described in any of my previous accounts, though I have attempted it more than once. They are not the silences of inactivity. They are more akin to the stillness of a watch spring fully wound. containing within their apparent quietude an energy so concentrated as to be almost palpable to anyone who knows where to look. He ate no luncheon that day. He declined Farrow's suggestion of a shared review of the remaining pages, on the grounds that the document as it presently stood was evidence first and legal instrument second, and ought not to be handled until he had completed his examination of the room in which it had resided. Farrow accepted this with good grace. The others accepted it with varying degrees of reluctance, which Holmes appeared not to notice, and which I was quite certain he catalogued with precision. I accompanied him back to the study at 1:30. He had obtained from Croft a small oil lamp, which he positioned on the desk at an oblique angle, explaining to me as he set it down that certain marks which daylight obscures become visible under directed artificial light. He then performed the most methodical examination of a room that I have witnessed in all our years together, and I have witnessed a considerable number. He began not with the desk, as I had expected, but with the perimeter. The skirting boards received 5 minutes of concentrated attention. The join between the floorboards and the hearthstone received rather more. He tapped the panelling in 3 places with his knuckle, listened and dismissed it with a brief shake of his head that I interpreted as the elimination of a theory of secret passage, though he had not mentioned one. When I suggested as much, he turned briefly and looked at me with an expression of mild exasperation. A hidden passage behind panelling of this age and construction would require, at minimum, a gap of 4 inches between the inner and outer walls, he said. The depth of the window embrasure is entirely consistent with the exterior stonework. There is no space. I did not seriously entertain the possibility, but one eliminates even the unserious hypotheses when thoroughness is the object. He moved to the desk. The scratch near the lock, which he had first observed the previous afternoon, he examined now for perhaps 3 minutes under the lamp. He produced from his coat pocket a small folded paper, and I saw him transfer to it, with the moistened tip of his finger, a fragment of something too fine for me to identify from where I stood. Brass, he said, without my having asked. A very small quantity of brass filings, consistent with a metal instrument being introduced to the lock mechanism. Not recently, however. These have the oxidized character of something deposited some weeks ago. Whoever made this mark was familiarizing themselves with the lock in advance. He straightened, refolded the paper, and placed it in his pocket. Not a duplicate key, Watson. A duplicate key requires no such exploration. This was a person learning by physical inquiry was the precise internal architecture of the mechanism. The desk blotter was next. Holmes tilted the lamp until its light crossed the surface at almost no angle at all, and in that raking illumination I could see what direct observation had entirely concealed. The blotter had been moved. The rectangular impression of its habitual position was visible in the leather of the desk surface, a faint paleness where the years had slightly faded the surrounding area, while the blotter itself sat a fraction of an inch to the left of where it belonged. It was the kind of displacement that one might produce by leaning across a desk in haste and catching the blotter with one's cuff, and yet it told Holmes something that held him motionless for nearly a full minute. "Someone stood on this side of the desk," he said at last, indicating the visitor's position, facing the chair. Not in the chair, standing, leaning forward and working quickly. The blotter was not the object of interest. It was moved incidentally in the course of reaching the document. A person seated in the judge's chair would have had no reason to displace it in this direction. I asked whether this confirmed that the alteration had been made during the afternoon session, when the document had been open and accessible, rather than in the night. Holmes did not answer directly. He crossed to the fireplace instead and knelt once more over the grate. With a small pair of tongs he moved the ash carefully, separating it into portions with a patience I found extraordinary, given what appeared to be the unvarying character of the material. What he found, after several minutes, was a fragment. It was perhaps 1.5 inches in length, the corner of a sheet of paper that had survived the burning by virtue of having been folded against the iron back of the grate, sheltered from the full heat of the flame. He lifted it with the tongs, carried it to the lamp, and examined it closely before permitting me to do the same. The paper was of a quality I associated with legal documents. On its surviving surface, in a clear and practised hand, were visible 5 words and a partial sixth. The full words were these, verified and witnessed by the just. The partial word that followed had lost all but its first 3 letters, which read com. Committee, I said. Almost certainly, Holmes agreed. The paper stock is consistent with the deposition folder. This is not a letter, not a memorandum. This is a draft or a copy of a portion of the original document. He set the fragment down on the edge of the desk with extraordinary care. Someone brought a version of this text to the study. They consulted it, made their alterations, and then burned it. The burning was incomplete, which suggests either haste or the interruption of the task. It was at this point that I offered the theory that had been forming in my mind throughout the examination. If the alteration had been made not during the night but during the afternoon session itself, when several people had been present in the room and the document was open on the desk, then the impossibility of the locked room ceased to be any kind of impossibility at all. Holmes regarded me with an expression that combined, in roughly equal measure, approval and the slight impatience of a man who has arrived at the same destination considerably earlier. The seal, he said, was never broken last night, because it did not need to be. The alteration was made while the document was open, and the group was assembled. The seal was then restored before the folder was closed. The entire performance of the locked room, the undisturbed latch, the key that never left Alderton's possession, was designed to direct our attention toward an impossible nocturnal intrusion, rather than toward a very possible act of substitution conducted in plain sight, in the presence of 6 witnesses, none of whom saw it because none of them were looking. He turned off the lamp and stood for a moment in the dimmer natural light of the window. "The difficulty," he said, with a quietness that I recognized as the register in which he expressed things that genuinely occupied him, "is not in understanding what was done. The method, I think, is becoming clear. The difficulty is that what was done required a degree of coordination and a degree of preparation that speaks to more than one person. Which means that in that room yesterday afternoon, whilst the rest of the party reviewed their first impressions of a sensitive government document, at least 2 members of the party were attending to an entirely different matter." He picked up his hat from the desk where he'd set it upon entering, and moved toward the door. "I should like," he said, "to speak to each of them individually this afternoon, beginning, I think, with the one who was most anxious to tell us what could not possibly have happened." Chapter 5. The Language of Movement. Holmes conducted his interviews in the small morning room at the eastern end of the hall, a space that recommended itself, as he observed to me beforehand, by virtue of having only one door, no connecting passages, and a window that faced the interior courtyard rather than the grounds, ensuring that no one passing outside might observe who entered or departed, or for how long. He positioned 2 chairs at an angle to one another, rather than in the direct confrontation of an interrogation, a deliberate arrangement that I recognized from earlier investigations as his method of encouraging a subject to speak more freely than the subject intended. He asked me to sit to one side with my notebook, not as a stenographer, he said, but as a presence. The distinction, I admit, was not immediately clear to me, though I have come to understand since that Holmes considered a silent witness to be among the most productive instruments of inquiry available, since the subject's awareness of being observed and recorded introduces a subtle pressure that a one-to-one conversation does not. He began with Renwick. The government agent entered the morning room with the composed deliberateness that appeared to be his natural gait, took the offered chair, and placed his hands upon his knees in the manner of a man entirely at his ease. Holmes offered him nothing by way of preamble, asking simply and directly where Renwick had been between the hours of 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock the previous afternoon, during and immediately following the study session. Renwick's account was fluent and specific. He had remained in the study for the full duration of the review, departing with the group when Alderton declared the session concluded at approximately 4:15. He had then gone directly to his room, where he had spent the remainder of the afternoon reviewing certain personal papers. He had dined, retired at 10, and slept without interruption. Holmes listened to all of this with his chin resting lightly upon his interlocked fingers and his eyes on a point somewhere between Renwick's face and the middle distance. He asked 3 supplementary questions. Had Renwick at any point during the review left the study, even briefly? No. Had he observed anyone else do so? No. Had he noticed anything unusual about the document during the session? Any hesitation in its handling? Any moment of irregular attention from another member of the group? Renwick considered this last question for precisely the right interval before answering in the negative, and it was that interval, I suspected, rather than the answer itself, that interested Holmes most. When Renwick had gone, Holmes sat for a moment without speaking. Then he said, to no one in particular, that a man who has nothing to conceal generally requires no interval at all to confirm the fact. Penhaligon was next, and the contrast could not have been more complete. The thin solicitor arrived in a state of visible agitation, sat down, and immediately began to speak before any question had been put to him, offering a detailed account of his movements that encompassed not merely the afternoon in question, but the entirety of his time at Blackridge Hall, and including the journey from London, the condition of the roads, his opinion of the guest rooms, and his long-standing professional relationship with Mr. Justice Alderton, the mention of which appeared to afford him considerable reassurance. Holmes allowed this to exhaust itself, and then asked with a quietness that stopped Penhaligon mid-sentence, whether the solicitor had noticed the position of the desk blotter during the review. Penhaligon blinked. He had not. Holmes thanked him and indicated that the interview was concluded. Penhaligon left, looking rather as though he had prepared extensively for an examination and been asked only to spell his own name. Carew was briefer still. He entered with the self-possession of a man who has decided in advance that he will not be made uncomfortable, and maintained this position throughout with admirable consistency. His account of the afternoon matched Renwick's in its essential structure: departure with the group, retirement to his room, dinner, bed, and was delivered in the tone of someone complying with a reasonable request whilst finding it faintly beneath him. Holmes asked him only one question of substance: whether he was acquainted with either Prine or Croft outside the context of the present gathering. Carew said he was not, with a promptness that closed the subject in a manner that was itself, I thought, a kind of answer. Farrow, when his turn came, sat with the weariness of a man watching something he had carefully constructed come apart along seams he could not identify. He was honest about his uncertainty, which was more than could be said for some of the others, and he answered Holmes's questions with a directness I found admirable under the circumstances. He confirmed that the arrangements for the gathering, including the selection of Blackridge Hall and the composition of the party, had been managed through official channels, and that the specific roster of attendees had been communicated in writing some 3 weeks prior to the assembly. Holmes noted this date carefully without comment. Prine was the last of the formal interviews, and the one I found most instructive to observe. The clerk came in quietly, as was his habit, and sat with his hands between his knees and his eyes directed generally toward the floor, the posture of a young man who has spent his professional life in rooms where his role was to record and not to be noticed. Holmes greeted him with a degree of warmth that was, and for Holmes, exceptional, and which I recognised as something other than courtesy. He asked Prine first about his work, his training, his particular skills in document handling and transcription. Prine answered these questions with a modest fluency, and something in his bearing relaxed fractionally, as the conversation occupied ground he evidently considered safe. Then Holmes asked him, with no change in his tone whatsoever, how long he had known Arden Croft. The relaxation ceased. It did not reverse itself into obvious alarm. Prine was more controlled than that. But the hands between his knees pressed more firmly together, and there was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds before he said that he did not believe he knew Mr. Croft beyond their recent acquaintance at Blackridge Hall. "Quite so," said Holmes pleasantly, and directed the conversation elsewhere entirely. After Prine had gone, Holmes rose and stood at the window, looking out at the courtyard where the snow had drifted against the far wall in a long, smooth, unbroken ridge. I asked him what he had observed. "Prine glances at the clock," he said. He's done so in every room we have shared with him since our arrival. Not from impatience, not from boredom. It is an unconscious habit of reference, the behaviour of someone for whom time is an instrument of precision. A man trained to record proceedings accurately learns to verify the hour as naturally as breathing. He turned from the window. Croft, meanwhile, avoids the hearth. In every communal room we have occupied, he positions himself at the greatest comfortable distance from the fireplace. For a steward responsible for the maintenance of household fires, this is an interesting aversion. A man who has recently used fire for a purpose he wishes to conceal will, for some days afterward, find the sight of flames an uncomfortable reminder. I said that this seemed to connect the two men to the burned fragment and to the study. It connects them to habits consistent with guilt, Holmes said carefully. It does not yet connect them to the act. There is a distinction, and it matters. He retrieved his pipe from his coat pocket and turned it in his fingers without lighting it. But there is something else. The alibis offered this afternoon were, taken individually, entirely plausible. Taken together, however, they are suspiciously harmonious. Renwick did not see anyone leave the study during the review. Carew did not see anyone leave. Penhaligon, too absorbed in the document to notice anything, nevertheless confirms that the session proceeded without incident. Three people who agree independently that nothing happened have a tendency to have agreed beforehand that nothing happened. He set the pipe down on the mantelpiece, a gesture I associated with a conclusion reached. The alibis were not merely constructed, he said, they were rehearsed. Chapter 6. Time, Altered and Observed. It was Holmes who first drew my attention to the clocks, though I had been walking past them for 2 days without seeing anything in them beyond their ornamental function. Blackridge Hall possessed 5 timepieces of a size sufficient to be consulted at a glance, the long case clock in the main corridor, which I have already mentioned as chiming fractionally late, a bracket clock on the mantelpiece of the sitting room, a small carriage clock on the writing table in the library, a painted dial above the servants' passage door near the kitchen, and a standing clock of considerable age and questionable elegance in the entrance hall, whose case was of dark oak, and whose face bore the name of a Bristol maker I did not recognise. It was this last that Holmes stood before on the afternoon following his interviews, his watch open in his palm, his expression one of quiet but animated interest. I joined him and drew out my own watch. The entrance hall clock read 23 minutes past 3. My watch, which I had set by the post office before our departure from London, and had not since adjusted, read 18 minutes past. The discrepancy was 5 minutes. Fast, I said. By 5 minutes, and as near as I can determine 20 seconds, Holmes said. Observe the bracket clock. He gestured toward the sitting room, and I walked to the doorway. The bracket clock there read 3:15, making it some 3 minutes behind my watch. The library carriage clock, Holmes continued, coming to stand beside me, is slow by 4 minutes. The servants' passage dial is accurate to within 30 seconds, which suggests it is wound and set by someone whose professional routine requires reliable timekeeping. The corridor long case, as I noted on our first evening, chimes late, and I can now tell you precisely how late. 8 seconds on the half hour, which compounds to approximately 16 on the hour. It is also running 2 minutes fast by the face. I looked at him. Someone has been adjusting them. Several someones, I think, or one person working with insufficient time to achieve consistency. The adjustments are not random, Watson. They are directional. The clocks in the public rooms where the guests spend their evenings have been advanced. The clocks in transitional spaces, corridors, passages, have been altered in the opposite direction. A person moving through this house and consulting its clocks to account for their movements would arrive at a version of yesterday afternoon's timeline that bears only approximate resemblance to what actually occurred. The implication settled upon me with the particular weight of the suddenly obvious. If the clocks in the rooms where the party had gathered before and after the study session had been advanced by several minutes, then the assembled guests might sincerely believe they had entered or left a room at one time when the true hour was somewhat different. Alibis formed in good faith from the evidence of adjusted clocks were alibis formed in effect upon a false foundation. Holmes produced from his pocket a small notebook, its pages closely covered in his cramped and distinctive hand. He had, I realised, been recording the state of every clock in the house at intervals throughout the day, a proceeding I had not observed him undertake, which was itself a comment on his capacity for unobtrusive industry. The adjustments were made between approximately 11 o'clock the previous morning and the beginning of the afternoon session, he said, tracing a finger down his notes. This I can determine from the differential between clocks that were set concurrently and those that were not. The entrance hall clock was adjusted last and least precisely, suggesting either that time was running short or that the person responsible was disturbed in the act. He closed the notebook. It required access to every room of consequence in the house. Who moves through the entirety of Blackridge Hall without attracting comment? The steward, I said immediately. The steward, Holmes confirmed. He began to walk, and I fell into step beside him, as I have done in Baker Street and in courts and in the streets of half a dozen cities, always with the agreeable sensation of keeping pace with a mind that moves rather faster than the legs beneath it. Croft's duties carry him through every room as a matter of course, a steward checking fires, overseeing the household preparations for the afternoon session, attending to the comfort of the guests, has legitimate reason to pass through the entrance hall, the sitting room, the library, the corridor. No one looks twice at a steward adjusting a clock. It is precisely the sort of small domestic service that renders a person invisible. We had reached the corridor, and Holmes paused at the long case clock, opening its case with the careful authority of a man who considers it his right to examine what interests him. He studied the mechanism for a moment, then pointed to a small but clear mark on the brass of the winding arbour. It was a scratch of the same character as those he'd found on the study lock, narrow and recent. Made with a key or a similar instrument, he said. Someone who does not regularly wind this clock was obliged to puzzle out the mechanism under time pressure. Croft winds this clock every Monday morning. Yesterday was a Wednesday. A different hand was at work. I put forward the question that had been gathering in my mind throughout this reconstruction. If Croft had adjusted the clocks to create a false timeline, and if the alteration of the document had been accomplished during the afternoon session by someone inside the study, then we had established a collaboration between the steward and one other person within the room itself. I asked Holmes whether he believed Prine to be that second party. Holmes did not answer immediately. We had come to a stop near the window at the corridor's end, where the evening light was failing over the snow in long blue shadows, the park reduced to a study in monochrome that would have pleased a landscape painter of the more melancholy school. When he spoke, it was with the measured precision of a man who distinguishes carefully between what he knows and what he suspects. Prine has the necessary skills, he said. He is trained in the handling of legal documents. He understands the construction and language of depositions. He knows how to work quickly and accurately under observation, because that is precisely what a court clerk is required to do. His entire professional existence has prepared him for exactly the act in question. He paused. Furthermore, he knew in advance that the document would be open and accessible during the review, because the agenda of the session had been circulated to all attendees in Farrow's preliminary communication. He had 3 weeks to prepare. And the wax seal? I asked. How was it restored without detection? Holmes turned from the window, and I saw in his expression the particular quality that I can only describe as the satisfaction of a theory that has cohered fully, but which he is not yet prepared to confirm aloud. The seal, he said, is the most elegant part of the scheme, and I will not speak to it until I have verified the last element. There is one more thing I require before I am willing to call this a conclusion rather than a hypothesis. He moved toward the staircase. I need to examine the contents of a travelling case. I asked him whose. I shall know that for certain, he said, beginning to climb, within the next quarter of an hour. The snow continued to fall outside, steady and indifferent, burying the world to its patient depth, and the house around us was quiet with the particular silence of people who know that something is approaching, but cannot yet determine from which direction it will come. Chapter 7. The Convenient Discovery. Holmes did not, as it proved, examine the travelling case that evening. Something intervened, and that something arrived in the person of Tobias Renwick, who appeared at the door of the sitting-room at 7:15 with an expression I had not previously seen upon his smooth and governable face. It was not alarm precisely, but it was the nearest thing to alarm that his particular style of self-possession appeared to permit, a tightening about the eyes, and a quality of deliberate stillness that in a less controlled man would have presented itself as agitation. He had found something, he said, in his room, in the fireplace of his room to be exact. He wished Mr. Holmes to see it immediately. We followed him upstairs. The room Renwick occupied was at the eastern end of the first-floor corridor, larger than my own, and furnished with the slightly impersonal comfort of a room that receives guests without being designed for habitation. The fireplace was of modest dimensions, its grate containing the remnants of a fire that had been allowed to die some hours earlier. Renwick pointed to the grate without approaching it, is in the manner of a man presenting evidence he considers beneath him to handle. Among the ash and the dull orange fragments of spent coal there lay, partially burned but substantially intact along one margin, several sheets of paper folded together. Holmes crossed to the fireplace without a word, knelt, and extracted the sheets with the same small tongs he had used in the study grate, handling them with a care that communicated their significance to the room without his needing to state it. He carried them to the lamp on the writing table and spread them flat. I looked over his shoulder. The paper was of the same quality as the Deposition folder, and the writing upon the surviving portions, though damaged, was legible enough for its character to be unmistakable. It was the Deposition text, or rather, it was a version of it. A handwritten draft of the altered passages, the substituted names and figures, set out in a clear and formal hand identical in several particulars to the hand in which the amended document in the study had been written. Renwick, standing behind us both, said that he could only conclude that the papers had been placed there by whoever had used his room in his absence, presumably during the afternoon, when he had been, as he had told Holmes, in the study for the review. He had not visited his fireplace since returning from dinner, and had only discovered the papers by chance when he stooped to add coal from the scuttle before retiring. He wished it understood that the discovery was entirely unsolicited. "I'm sure it was," Holmes said without inflection. He studied the papers for several minutes in silence, the rest of us, myself. Renwick and Farrow, who had been passing in the corridor when we ascended and had followed at a discreet distance, occupied the room in the particular quiet of people waiting for a verdict. Holmes touched the margins of the burned sheets with one fingertip, examined the fold marks, held one page briefly at an angle to the lamp, and then set it down and stood with his back to us, his hands clasped behind him. Renwick spoke first. He said, with a careful precision that struck me as rehearsed, that he recognised the compromised position in which discovery of such documents in his room placed him, and that he therefore wished to make a frank disclosure. He had known, before arriving at Blackridge Hall, that the deposition contained testimony implicating officials in his own department in financial improprieties that, if made public, would not merely embarrass but potentially destroy the careers of men he considered loyal servants of the Crown. He had come to the gathering with the intention, he said, of assessing whether the document could be rendered less damaging through legitimate channels of legal argument. He had, however, taken no action upon the document itself, and had no knowledge of how the draft had come to be in his fireplace. There was a silence considerably longer than the previous one. Farrow looked at Holmes. Holmes, who had turned from the window during Renwick's disclosure, and stood now with his arms folded and his eyes on the middle distance, did not immediately respond. He allowed the confession to remain in the room for a full 30 seconds, the way a doctor might allow a patient to hear the echo of their own symptoms before offering a diagnosis. "You have been very candid," he said at last. "I thought it the wiser course," Renwick said. "Yes," Holmes agreed pleasantly. "I imagine you did." He folded the partially burned pages with great care and placed them in the inner pocket of his coat. He then thanked Rennick for his cooperation, suggested that Farrow might wish to record the disclosure in some appropriate form, and drew me from the room with a slight inclination of his head that had, over the years, come to function as efficiently as a spoken instruction. In the corridor, Holmes pulled the door quietly closed and stood for a moment with one hand still on the knob, his expression entirely composed. "Well," I said, when it became apparent that he would not speak first. "Theatrical," he said. "Exceedingly so." He began to walk not toward his own room but toward the staircase, descending with the unhurried step of a man who is thinking rather than moving. "The papers in the fireplace are genuine, Watson. The writing matches the amended deposition. The paper stock is correct. The fold marks are consistent with documents that have been carried inside a coat, rather than in a portfolio, which is itself interesting. But the burning is wrong." I asked what was wrong with it. "Those sheets were placed in a cold grate and set alight from a single point at the lower corner. The burning pattern is entirely consistent with a small flame applied once and then left to its own devices. A person who is genuinely attempting to destroy incriminating evidence destroys it completely, or as completely as a domestic fireplace permits. They do not set it alight from one corner and leave it to smouldering completely in a bed of old ash." He paused on the landing. "These papers were arranged to be found, Watson. Renwick did not find them by accident when reaching for the coal scuttle. A man who has spent his professional life in guarded rooms does not fail to notice charred paper in his own fireplace at the first glance. He noticed them, assessed his situation, and then presented the discovery in the manner most advantageous to himself. I said that if Renwick had placed the papers there himself, his confession had served to direct all suspicion away from him by making him the person who had least to gain from discovery. Precisely. It is a considerable manoeuvre. He has transformed himself from a suspect into a witness. Holmes descended the remaining stairs and turned toward the library. The confession is true, incidentally, or largely so. He almost certainly came here with the intention of minimizing the deposition's damage through whatever means presented themselves. But the particular means that presented themselves, the draft papers, the burned evidence, the timely discovery, those were prepared by someone else and placed in his room to serve a purpose. And that purpose was to resolve the investigation here, tonight, with Renwick's ambition as its explanation, and Renwick's embarrassment as its conclusion. He opened the library door and stood in the threshold. "Someone very much wishes this matter closed," he said, "and they wish it closed in a direction that protects two people who have not yet been examined with sufficient attention." He looked at me. "Tomorrow morning I intend to give them that attention. But tonight I mean to find the travelling case, because I believe it will tell me the one thing that I do not yet know with certainty." He went in. I remained a moment in the corridor, listening to the silence of the house, and to the snow pressing its patient weight against every window, and to the low sound of the wind beginning to rise outside, which was the first suggestion I had received in 2 days that the weather might, eventually, change. Chapter 8. The Weight of a False Truth. The travelling case belonged to Prine. Holmes told me this the following morning over breakfast in the quiet interval before the rest of the house descended, when the dining room held only the two of us and the particular clarity of early light on fresh snow. He had found it the previous night in the room the clerk occupied, a small leather case of the kind a professional man carries for the tools of his trade, and had examined its contents without disturbing them. He described what he had found with characteristic economy: a roll of fine copper wire no thicker than a hatpin, 3 sticks of sealing wax of a dark red colour, and a small cylindrical instrument of brass approximately 2 inches in length, and one end of which had been turned and polished to a surface of particular smoothness. I stared at him. A seal. A replica of the original signet impression, Holmes said. Machined, I would estimate, by a craftsman of some skill, working from either a wax impression or a detailed drawing of the original. It is the instrument with which the seal was restored after the document's alteration. Heat the wax gently, lift the impression intact, substitute the pages, and reseal with fresh wax of matching colour. applying the replica before the wax sets. Correctly done, the result is indistinguishable from the original without microscopic examination. It requires a steady hand, a precise tool, and a thorough familiarity with the physical properties of sealing wax. He poured his tea. It also requires time and an undisturbed space in which to work. The afternoon session provided both, for a man who knew how to use them. The picture that had been assembling itself across the preceding days was now, in all its essential lines, complete. Prine had prepared the substitute pages in advance, carrying them in the inner pocket of his coat. During the afternoon review, using the temporal confusion created by Croft's clock adjustments, he had found his moment, worked at the desk while the group's attention was distributed, lifted the seal, substituted the relevant pages, and resealed the folder before it was returned to its position. The burned draft in the study grate was his own working copy, destroyed once its purpose was served, though imperfectly. The whole had been accomplished not in the night, and not by any means that required the impossible, but in a room occupied by 6 witnesses, none of whom had looked at the right thing at the right moment. I said as much to Holmes. He agreed, and then was silent for a moment in a way that suggested agreement was not the whole of his response. "You have described the mechanism accurately," he said, "and yet I find myself disinclined to present it this morning." I asked him why. He set down his cup. Rennick's performance last night was designed to produce a conclusion, a satisfying, sufficiently credible conclusion that resolves the immediate difficulty and allows the party to disperse once the snow clears. "The group is disposed to accept it, Watson." Farrow recorded the disclosure. Alderton, when Farrow informed him last evening, received the news with the relief of a man who had feared something considerably worse. Even Carew, who has maintained throughout the studied indifference of someone with nothing at stake, was noticeably less tense at dinner. "They believe the matter settled," I said. "They wish to believe it settled, which is not quite the same thing, but produces similar results." He rose from the table and moved to the window, where the morning light lay flat and white across the untouched snow. The wind of the previous evening had dropped. The sky was pale but no longer dense, and in its altered quality I read the first suggestion of a coming thaw. If I produce my reconstruction this morning, 2 things occur. First, Prine and Croft, being immediately aware that their scheme has been exposed, have every incentive to destroy or conceal any remaining evidence before the road's clear and proper authorities can be summoned. Second, and rather more importantly, I do not yet have the motive. This surprised me. I said so. "I have the method in full," Holmes said without turning from the window. "I have the collaboration. I have the physical evidence of preparation and execution. What I do not have, with any certainty, is why. Renwick's motive is clear and he has given it himself, political protection of departmental colleagues. But Rennick did not alter the document. He is an opportunist who arrived at Blackridge Hall hoping to bend the process through persuasion, found that someone else had already bent it through rather more direct means, and then made the best of an unexpected advantage. He turned. But Prine and Croft had a different motive entirely, one that has nothing to do with parliamentary committees or departmental reputations. He said no more on the matter then, and the gradual assembly of the other guests into the dining room precluded further private discussion. But I watched throughout the morning as the false resolution established itself in the room with the comfortable authority of a story that everyone present had decided, for their various reasons, to find convincing. The shift in atmosphere was remarkable. Farrow was more talkative than at any point since our arrival. Penhaligon had recovered his spectacles and his composure simultaneously, and occupied himself with a volume from the library with the contentment of a man released from an obligation he had found disagreeable. Carew suggested at one point that the snow appeared to be softening, and did so in the tone of someone for whom that development represented an uncomplicated good. Even Alderton, who had carried the weight of the deposition's integrity upon his considerable shoulders since the discovery, seemed to move more freely, as though a verdict had been reached and the court adjourned. Rennick himself was the most interesting study of all. He had adopted overnight the manner of a man who has made a difficult confession and emerged from it, if not exonerated, then at least unburdened. He was pleasant at breakfast. He asked after my medical practice with what appeared to be genuine interest. He complimented Mrs. Croft, the steward's wife, who had undertaken the cooking in the absence of an available kitchen staff, upon the quality of her soup, a remark that was both gracious and, I could not help thinking, designed to be observed. Holmes watched all of this with an expression of settled patience. He spoke little, declined Farrow's twice-repeated invitation to present a formal account of his conclusions, and spent the larger part of the morning apparently engaged with a monograph on the regional variations of English church architecture that he had extracted from the library shelves. I say apparently, because I know Holmes well enough to understand that the book was held at the correct angle for a man whose attention is directed not at the page, but at the room reflected in the window glass behind it. It was in the early afternoon that I observed the thing Holmes had predicted. Prine and Croft, having exchanged no word in my presence throughout the morning, were briefly in proximity near the entrance hall. There was between them no conversation, not even the ordinary domestic exchange that a guest might have with a steward. Instead, as Prine descended the staircase and Croft passed below on some errand, there passed between them a glance of no more than a second's duration. I would not have called it significant had Holmes not told me to watch for it. Having been told, I saw in it precisely what he had described, the compressed communication of two people who have a shared secret and a shared anxiety, reassuring one another, in the only way available to them in a house full of witnesses, that the resolution they had worked to produce was holding. I reported it to Holmes that evening. He nodded, unsurprised. "The false truth is settling," he said. "They believe themselves safe, which is exactly where I want them." He closed the church architecture monograph and placed it tidily on the side table, and I noticed as he did so that he had not opened it once. Chapter 9. The Reconstruction. The thaw arrived the following morning, not dramatically but with the quiet persistence of a season reasserting itself, the eaves beginning to drip before 8 o'clock, and the snow on the south-facing slopes acquiring that heavy, grey-edged quality that precedes dissolution. The roads would not be passable until the afternoon, but the change in the weather carried through the house an unmistakable shift of expectation. Bags were mentally packed. Conversations acquired the slightly provisional quality of exchanges between people who were already, in some portion of their attention, elsewhere. Holmes had been awake before dawn. When I descended at 7:30, he was in the library, and he had been there, I suspected, for some hours. The table before him held 3 things: the partially burned draft recovered from the study fireplace, the surviving fragment I had found earlier, and a sheet of his own notepaper covered in a close comparison of letter forms that he had evidently been conducting by lamplight. He looked up when I entered, with the clear eyes of a man who has not slept and has not needed to. "Sit down, Watson," he said. "I want to tell you about an estate in Northumberland." He had found it, he explained, in the course of the night, through the application of a method I had observed him use before. The correlation of a small physical detail with a body of specialised knowledge accumulated over years of study. The paper stock of the draft pages was not merely legal quality paper. It was a specific blend, slightly cream in tone and with a particular weight and tooth, manufactured for a single firm of law stationers in Chancery Lane, whose primary client was the legal department of the Crown Estate. Holmes had identified this from the fragment in the first hours of the investigation, but had withheld the significance pending confirmation. The Crown Estate, he continued, administered among its many properties a portfolio of Northumberland land holdings that had been under review for the past 3 years following allegations, raised internally and never publicly aired, of systematic embezzlement by a firm of managing agents. The deposition gathered by the Parliamentary Committee contained in its original form testimony identifying the architects of that scheme, testimony provided by a senior official who had, at considerable personal risk, agreed to speak on record. The names in that testimony, Holmes had now confirmed by comparison of the draft pages with his own knowledge of the relevant proceedings, were not those of parliamentary figures or departmental chiefs. They were the names of private individuals, an estate management firm, its senior partner, and a man named in the document as the firm's principal financial officer and silent partner, whose connection to the estate's administration had been entirely concealed from the committee's investigators. That man's name was also Croft. Not Arden Croft, the steward of Blackridge Hall, whose Christian name and initials were distinct. His elder brother, a man named Edmund Croft, who had been the silent financial architect of an embezzlement scheme that had diverted over the course of 11 years a sum Holmes estimated at no less than £40,000 from the management accounts of Crown properties in the north of England. The testimony in the original deposition, if placed before the committee, would have destroyed Edmund Croft and sent him to prison. It would also almost certainly have implicated those members of his immediate family who had received the proceeds of his scheme, among them, by inference, and by the evidence of a modest country stewardship that could not by its salary alone account for its holder's evident financial comfort, Arden Croft himself. I sat for a moment in the quiet of the library, with the sound of dripping water from the eaves and the low light of a winter morning coming slowly stronger through the windows. "And Prine?" I said. "Prine I believe to be a man with debts," Holmes said. "The ink stains on his fingers are not uniform. He uses 2 different qualities of ink, one for professional work and one for what I suspect is private correspondence of a financial character. Men who write a great many letters about money develop a particular relationship with their writing materials, Watson. I've observed it before. He was recruited, I think, rather than motivated by personal connection to the scheme. He had the skills required and the need that makes a man receptive to an offer he would not otherwise have entertained. He closed his notebook and set it beside the burned pages with the finality of a man who has said what needs saying in private and is now ready to say it in company. At 10:30, Holmes asked Farrow to assemble the party in the sitting room. He made the request in the tone of a man inviting colleagues to a discussion, not the tone of an accuser summoning the accused, and Farrow, who had learned over the preceding days to treat Holmes's requests as instructions of a practical, rather than optional character, complied without question. They assembled with the slightly reluctant punctuality of people who sense that a comfort they have been enjoying is about to be disturbed. Rennick took his customary chair. Carew stood near the window. Alderton sat with his hands upon his knees and his eyes on Holmes with the attention of a man who has judged proceedings long enough to know when the decisive moment has arrived. Prine sat to the left of the fireplace. Croft stood near the door, as was proper for a servant in a room of principals, but his position near the exit struck me differently this morning than it had on previous days. Holmes stood before the cold hearth and spoke without preamble. He described the afternoon session in precise detail. He described the clock adjustments and named Croft as their author, observing the effect of this upon the steward's face with the dispassion of a man reading a familiar text. He described the substitution of the pages, the preparation of the replica seal, the burned draft, and the travelling case and its contents. He named Prine. He explained the mechanism of the seal's restoration without drama, in the language of simple physical process, which was, I have always thought, the most devastating register available to him, since it removes from a crime all possibility of mystification and leaves it standing as what it actually is. Then he spoke about Edmund Croft and the Northumberland estates, and I watched Arden Croft's face undergo a change that I will not attempt to describe beyond saying that it was the face of a man watching a structure he has spent years constructing come down in something under 4 minutes. Prine said nothing throughout. He sat very still, as he had sat in the interview room 3 days earlier, his hands flat upon his thighs. And when Holmes concluded, he did not look at Croft and did not look at Renwick. He looked at the floor and continued to look at it, with the expression of a man who has already, some time before the verdict, reached his own conclusion about his situation. Rennick, to his credit, did not attempt to build upon Holmes's exposition. He had the instincts of a man who knows when a position has become untenable, and who does not waste energy defending it. He asked Holmes, with the composure of someone shifting from one professional mode to another, whether the original deposition text could be recovered. "It has not been destroyed," Holmes said. "Burning a substitute is easier than burning an original, and considerably less final. I believe the original pages are in this house. As I also believe that when the roads are clear and the appropriate authorities have been notified, a thorough search will confirm that belief." He looked at Croft. Croft looked back at him for a long moment, and then the steward, with the particular weariness of a man released from a pretence that has become heavier than the truth it concealed, lowered his eyes and said nothing. The room was very quiet. Outside, the snow continued its long, slow retreat, and somewhere in the distance a bird called once and was silent, and the morning moved forward, as mornings do, regardless of the constructions men erect against it. Chapter 10. The Restoration of Order. The original deposition was found at 2:30 that afternoon, inside a hollow ledger on the lower shelf of the estate office bookcase. It was a room adjacent to the kitchens that Croft administered as part of his daily duties, and which no member of the assembled legal party had occasion to enter. Holmes had directed the search himself, accompanying Alderton and Farrow through the office, with the methodical patience of a man who is not searching but confirming, and it was he who drew the ledger from the shelf, held it at an angle, felt the weight of it, and set it upon the estate office desk with the quiet satisfaction of a physician who has located, by palpation, precisely what he expected to find. The ledger spine had been carefully unstitched and restitched, the pages hollowed over perhaps a third of their depth to accommodate a folded document without producing any external distortion in the volume's silhouette. The workmanship was neat and patient. Alderton examined the restored pages of the deposition in silence, turning each with the deliberateness of a man for whom documents are not merely paper, but instruments of considerable human consequence. When he had finished, he looked up at Holmes with an expression in which professional composure and personal gratitude were mixed in roughly equal measure, and said only that the text was complete and unaltered. Holmes acknowledged this with a slight nod and said nothing further on the subject. Croft had, in the interval since the sitting-room assembly, undergone the particular diminishment that follows the removal of a sustained pretence. He sat in the estate office chair, to which Farrow had directed him with the quiet authority of a man reassuming control of his own proceedings, and answered questions in a tone so much flatter and more honest than anything he had offered over the preceding days that the contrast was itself a kind of confession. He confirmed the connection to his brother without evasion. Edmund Croft, he said, had been to him less a criminal than an elder brother to whom he had owed debts of a personal kind accumulated across a lifetime, and when Edmund had required his assistance in a matter that Arden had known to be wrong but had persuaded himself was not irrevocable, he had provided it. He had arranged the posting to Blackridge Hall. He had adjusted the clocks. He had given Prine access to the study during the hours when his position as steward made his presence unremarkable, and he had kept the original document after the substitution under the belief that it might, at some future point, be a source of leverage rather than a liability. It was this last detail, offered in a tone of exhausted candour, that struck me as the most telling of all. He had not destroyed the original, because he had not been able to bring himself to close every exit. It is a characteristic of people who undertake dishonest schemes with honest temperaments that they preserve, unconsciously, the means of their own undiscovery, as though some portion of them requires that the truth remain accessible even at personal cost. Prine, when his turn came, confirmed Holmes's surmise about his recruitment, without requiring much encouragement. He had been approached through an intermediary he would only describe as a mutual professional acquaintance, had been made aware of the nature of the task required, and had accepted terms that he now found, he said, with the weary honesty of hindsight, considerably less generous than the risk they had purchased. He was a skilled man who had let skill become a commodity, and had not, until it was rather too late, inquired into the character of the buyer. He asked, with a quietness that contained more dignity than I had expected from a man in his position, whether his cooperation in the full account of the scheme would be considered by the relevant authorities. Farrow said that it would be noted. Whether it would be considered was a matter for others to determine. The roads cleared by 4 o'clock, sufficiently at least for a single vehicle to navigate the lane to the village, from which telegraph communications could be restored. Farrow dispatched Carew with a message to the appropriate department in London. Learson posed with the compressed efficiency of a man who has spent a professional life communicating complicated matters in a minimum of words. Alderton retained the deposition in his own custody, the key to the study on his person, and the document itself in the inner pocket of his coat, a position from which, I suspected, it would not be removed until it was placed directly into the hands of the Parliamentary Committee. Holmes and I departed Blackridge Hall on the following morning. The thaw had continued through the night, and the park presented in the early light the particular dishevelment of a landscape in the process of recovering itself, the snow receding from the lawn in uneven patches, the gravel drive re-emerging in strips, the beaches dropping their accumulated burdens in intermittent soft collisions that broke the quiet at irregular intervals. Mrs. Croft, a silent and contained woman who had managed the household's catering throughout our stay with exemplary competence, and who had, I gathered, known nothing of her husband's involvement until the previous afternoon, stood at the door as we left and watched our carriage depart with the expression of a woman rearranging with great internal effort her understanding of a life she had believed she knew. We were perhaps a mile from the hall, the carriage moving at a cautious pace over the softening road, when Holmes spoke for the first time since our departure. "The seal," he said, with the reflective air of a man completing a thought that has been running quietly for some time. "That is what will stay with me longest about this case. Not the clock adjustments, not the substitution, not Rennick's very competent performance of injured candour. The seal, because everything else in the scheme was opportunistic. The posting, the clocks, the recruited clerk, the convenient discovery in Rennick's fireplace. All of these were adaptations to circumstance, but the seal was prepared weeks in advance. Someone had the original seal impression taken or copied, had a replica machined, and brought it to Blackridge Hall in a travelling case, on the very reasonable expectation that a sealed document would be present and would need to be restored after interference. That is not opportunism, Watson. That is commitment." I observed that it was also the single element of the scheme most clearly attributable to Prynne, he whose skills and professional access made him the likeliest source of both the impression and the commission. And the likeliest conduit to whoever originally commissioned the scheme, Holmes agreed. Edmund Croft is, I suspect, rather more than a managing agent, but he is a matter for others to pursue, and I am satisfied that the material is now in hands that will pursue it. He settled back against the carriage seat and looked out at the retreating landscape with the equable detachment of a man whose interest in a matter concludes precisely at the point where his contribution to it has been made. I have often been asked, in the years since I began setting down these accounts, what it is about Holmes's method that most recommends itself to my admiration. I find the question, on reflection, less easily answered than it might appear. The deductive facility is remarkable, certainly, and the breadth of his preparatory knowledge is extraordinary in its application, if not always in its apparent utility. But these are, in the end, instruments. They are wielded in the service of something that I think receives rather less acknowledgment than it deserves. Holmes believes, with a conviction so fundamental that he rarely troubles to articulate it, that the truth of a matter is always present and always accessible to a sufficiently attentive observer. Not approximately present, not partially recoverable, but wholly and precisely there, inscribed in the physical world with a permanence that human ingenuity may obscure but cannot erase. The clock adjusted by a degree more or less than intended, the ash of an inconsistent fuel, a blotter displaced by a fraction of an inch, a seal replica carried in a leather case by a nervous clerk who glanced always at the nearest timepiece in every room he occupied. These things are not clues in the romantic sense of the word. They are simply facts, quietly insisting upon themselves in the midst of whatever arrangement of appearances has been constructed around them. Holmes's peculiar genius, as I have come to understand it, is not that he sees what others cannot. It is that he has never, in all the years of his extraordinary practice, made the ordinary human error of seeing only what he expected. The carriage turned onto the main road, and the going became easier, and the pale January sun made a tentative appearance between the clouds and cast long shadows across the fields, and Holmes filled his pipe, and I watched the country open before us. And neither of us said anything more for a considerable time, which was, in its way, entirely sufficient